Before we get into the applications of this topical list, we have to break down the misconception regarding the Ten Commandments. Many people, including the rabbis, falsely believe that the Ten Commandments are in some way the pinnacle of the 5 books of Moses, but they are wrong. The Ten Commandments are holy, but God never intended them. The rabbis in part teach that this is why Israel left Egypt, to get the Ten Commandments. And if this is part of the reason why God rescued Israel from Egypt, then why didn't God tell that to Moses at the burning bush? Or while Israel was in Egypt, why didn't God just say that to Moses? From everything we know up until Exodus 19, all God wanted was Israel out of Egypt so they could worship Him in the wilderness and be freed from their slavery. When we examine any set of commandments in the books of Moses, the one thing that we see frequently is that laws were added after Israel committed sins. This is why Paul says this. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions. To teach that the reason for the exodus from Egypt was to receive the Ten Commandments is to teach that the reason for the exodus from Egypt was because God wanted Israel to sin. And that is just impossible. Paul goes on, and this part really messes with the rabbis' perfunctory understanding of the Torah. The law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ. The only question that matters now is, what was the Ten Commandments tutoring? There is a real easy way to figure this out. And I am now going to use the JPS translation of Exodus 19 and part of Deuteronomy, of God's giving of the Ten Commandments, because it is the most consistent translation for the events that happened at Mount Sinai with Moses and the children of Israel. Let them be ready for the 3rd day. You shall set bounds for the people round about, saying, beware of going up the mountain or touching the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall either be stoned or shot, beast or man. He shall not live. When the ram's horn sounds a long blast, they may go up on the mountain. So what did Israel do when the ram's horn sounded on the 3rd day? On the 3rd day, the blare of the horn grew louder and louder. God calls to Moses in verse 20. And Israel disobeys God's voice. And because there can be a little confusion here, here is Moses' retelling of this pivotal event in Deuteronomy. I stood between the Lord and you at the time to convey the Lord's words to you. For you were afraid of the fire and did not go up the mountain. Moses here admits that going up the mountain was what God intended, and Israel disobeyed. The sin that precipitated the need for the Ten Commandments was the sin of disobeying God's voice and not going up the mountain. After Israel sinned, they needed a voice tutor. A voice tutor that the great Abraham did not need, though at times he struggled. Let's look at 3 choices Abraham made, and some other examples from my book where the voice tutor is useful in biblical study and in life. Choice 1. Abraham chooses to move. Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. In this first example, in verse 1, Abraham listens to God's command and leaves his society or country and his father's house, his family. In the Make Abraham Great verse, which makes up verse 2, we first have God saying he will make Abraham a great nation. And the beginning of this can be realized with how God protects Abraham. For instance, Sarah gets taken to the Pharaoh to become his wife when Abraham goes down to Egypt because of the famine. And what does God do to the Pharaoh? The Lord struck the Pharaoh and his house with great plagues. God begins to show here that he will protect all of what's in Abraham's life, anything Abraham loves, and this includes Lot. When he gets kidnapped by the 4 kings in Genesis 14, Abraham wins the war to get Lot back. When you are at least more powerful militarily than 4 kings that rule the area of Canaan, I think it's obvious that God has already fulfilled the beginning of the promise to make Abraham a great nation. And this, and the promise to make Abraham's name great, would be about Abraham's life. Both of these promises were fulfilled while Abraham was still alive. But there is also another way God intended to make Abraham great, and that is by the reiteration of this promise in Genesis 15, when God adds sex to the list. Now look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Also, to make Abraham great, God compares Abraham's descendants to the stars of the sky. Finally, in verse 3, we have the blessing and the curse. And just like the story of Pharaoh being cursed with plagues for taking Abraham's wife, the blessing and the curse tops off the Abrahamic Covenant, with justice being the final component. In verse 1 of chapter 12, we have God, country, and family in that order. In verse 2 of 12, we have life, and how God will make Abraham great in the reiteration of the Abrahamic Covenant by giving him innumerable descendants, which adds sex. And finally, in verse 3, to top it all off, we have justice. And once you have justice, as the people of Chaz or Chop will be able to tell you, property can be protected. The Abrahamic Covenant can be pearl strung together with the 10 Commandments. It follows the same pattern. Hidden within the Abrahamic Covenant is the topical order of the 10 Commandments. And the rabbis didn't know this, and that's because they don't know God's Son, Jesus Christ. God speaks this way. And when you hear anything within your spirit or your mind that contradicts this order, you must reject it. Or you are to reject the person telling it to you. A famous example of Abraham not rejecting thoughts that twisted this order is the story of when he told his wife to lie to the Pharaoh. So later on in chapter 12, Abraham goes through what will later be called Israel. God promises him the land, and because of a famine in Israel, he goes down to Egypt. Choice 2, to lie. It came about when he came near Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. And they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. God cannot speak in an order that twists the topical order of the 10 Commandments. Abraham hears within himself that he should put his life, number 4, ahead of God in the topical order, and he obeys his thoughts. How so, you ask? Abraham was not a great nation yet. His name was not great yet. All of the nations of the earth were not blessed in him yet. And if Abraham died here, From everything he knew about God at this point, God would have been lying to Abraham about the promises at the beginning of chapter 12. So Abraham, thinking he needs to lie here to help God out, reverts this order, which is the source of his faith failure and all your faith failures. The order is God, society, family, then life and sex. But when Abraham asked his wife to lie, the order to save his life became life before God, with even sex being used to save his life. Life, sex, then God, in that order specifically. When you think your life is in danger, like Abraham thought here, you'll be in a lack of knowledge about what to do, how things will play out, and whether you will survive. This will test this order. The lack of knowledge always tests this order, and Abraham failed this test. Or saying this in the faith language of Hebrews 11, rather than the faith language of the Garden of Eden, Abraham was blind to, could not see how God was able to save him from the Pharaoh. So he lost this hope and asked his wife to lie, twisting the order of the 10 Commandments. In chapter 11 of my book, Faith and the Lack of Knowledge, I write about a topic that I don't really ever hear preached in churches. And it's probably because of how humiliating and embarrassing it is. I show how Satan destroys families and churches with sex just by twisting this order and placing number 5, sex, ahead of number 3, family, and number 2, society, in importance. Here is a quote on the former. When sexuality becomes more important than the first 4 topics of the 10 Commandments, there are major problems in a person's life, at least according to the morality of the Bible. For example, Satan can make a pedophile only by making sex more important than family in a person's life. Sexuality is number 5 in importance. Family is number 3. A father or mother cannot molest a child until that switch happens. Any feeling or thought trying to revert this order cannot be God. It can only be Satan. There have been many psychological studies done on trying to understand how pedophiles think and why they think the way they do. But the answer is simple. It's called giving into temptation, which is measured by accepting the twisted order of the 10 Commandments by placing 5, sex, ahead of 3, family, and ahead of 2, society, for a pedophile priest. And all temptation is an attempt to stress this order. Choice 3, to sacrifice his son. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said to him, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." To understand the full implications of what is going on here between God and Abraham, we have to read part of the chapter before God tests Abraham. Abraham is told before these verses by his wife to get rid of Ishmael, whom he also loves, because he was mocking Isaac. "Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be heir or inheritor with my son Isaac." Sarah wanted only Isaac to inherit all the promises that Abraham was given by God, and she wanted Ishmael and his mother cut off from them. How did Abraham feel about this? The matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. But God told Abraham not to worry and to listen to Sarah, because through Isaac your descendants shall be named. So Isaac will inherit all the promises, and by this point in Abraham's life, we know how easy it has become for him to listen and obey God's voice. So now when Abraham is told to offer Isaac as a burnt offering, everything and every topic of the 10 Commandments is on the line. Because all the promises that will be inherited will only be inherited through Isaac. Let me add this. God expects no less from you. He expects you to walk up your own Mount Moriah and offer it all to Him. What was the lack of knowledge that Abraham stood in according to the writer of Hebrews? Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. Though being in a complete lack of knowledge, in the sense that he had never seen someone raised from the dead before, he believed in the lack of knowledge, or believed though blind, because he knew that God could not lie and would have to keep His word about all His promises and descendants coming through Isaac. Abraham here shows he was born again with a new covenant heart hundreds of years before the Ten Commandments were even given. He had fulfilled them. Because of this act of faith, Abraham established the Abrahamic Covenant and the New Covenant as the chief covenants over all the earth. Here's another quote from my book, Faith and the Lack of Knowledge. And it will help you understand how Satan made the Mafia and how he can make any American politician sell out their country to China just by twisting the order. How did Satan make the Mafia? All he had to do was make family, which is often what the Mafia refers to itself as, more important than God and society. Without that shift, there would be no Mafia. All Satan has to do to make a corrupt politician is switch 6, justice, with 7, property. Once this has happened, our political system will value property more than justice and will accept property to eliminate justice. You can go through all the books of the Old and New Testaments and see all the saints living this order out and all the sinners living contrary to this order. And you can use this tutor in your own life to see how much of the things you and your friends do that is not pleasing to God. This order really exposes the fakers in our religion. Also, you can see how much of your thinking is involuntary or how much of your thinking is intrusive. But know this, when random thoughts come into your spirit in this order, it can only be the one and only God, because God is the only one that speaks in this order. The devil can never speak in this order, ever. I have met so many people fulfilling this topical arrangement without even knowing that there is an arrangement. You can do this too. Go to your church with this order in mind and watch everyone who loves God make all their decisions based on this order, though they are in a complete lack of knowledge about it. How is that possible? You can put your hand on your heart and say, "Thank you, Jesus. Everything is copacetic. This new heart is concrete, much like the Hebrew language. It is the heart that started the revolution. Every time we bring somebody to Christ, it is this heart and this order that guides them."